of course, we've got, hang on, I cannot miss out on anything. The author signing corner is right here. So post every session, the authors will be headed there. So please feel free to go there. For today, I would also really like to thank Cafe Mitti for the breakfast bags for the school children that have all come in today. So another friend of KSLF. Now, we move on to the next session for today. And the next session for today is the speaker is Amit Varma. He's a writer and podcaster based in Mumbai. He has very clearly told me not to talk about him. So I'm going to quickly get him on the stage. Amit, can we have you here, please? The topic for today is the evolving forms of creativity, podcasts, graphic novels, and more. A gamut of innovations around books. Ladies and gentlemen, Amit Varma. Oh, Hari, can we have the podium kept up, please? Hari? My bad, I forgot to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Just give us a moment, just a moment. Hari? Can I have somebody from the production team, please, quickly? Production team, quickly, we need to put the podium up. It's not heavy though, even I can do it.
To protect me from projectiles.
Isko upar rakh denge, please.
Oh, I can speak into that. So I don't need this. I'll keep it here just in case it's not working or something. Got it. Hello, check. Can you hear me at the back? Yes, they can hear me. I hope you're having a good time. I'm having a great time. People are thinking of going there. मैं वहाँ जा चुका हूँ. वहाँ कुछ नहीं है. Just hang on here. This session will change your life. It will make you older by 20 to 40 minutes. Hello, can you hear me now? All right, great. I was just saying the session will change your life. It will make you older by 40 minutes. Can I have okay, I have my PowerPoint. So and I asked her to, keep the introduction very brief, which thankfully she did, because for the first couple of minutes, I will be talking about what I do, because that journey is what led me to the central insight, which I want to talk about at some length. What I want to do in this session is I want to take you through a very brief potted history of music, the audiovisual medium, writing. And my central point is that this is the golden age for creative expression, that we have more means to express ourselves than we ever did before, not simply in the really banal way that, okay, internet hai, we can publish our own stuff, but in the sense that a lot of us, whether we want to write or whether we want to do something in cinema, are stuck by thinking of older forms, which evolved for a particular reason because of constraints, and those are no longer relevant to us. So we need to kind of free our mind. For example, you think, if you write, you'll think of a book, you'll think 200 page ki book hai, or you will, I'll shut this, or you will, think of a 90-minute film, or you'll think of a 3-minute pop song or a 40-minute album. And the thing is, there's no magic behind these particular forms. They evolved because of constraints that once existed and no longer do. So that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. I think William had some problems with the slideshow. We shall see if I can get it moving. And it seems I can't. So when I tell you to hit a button, just hit the button, right? Yeah, that's the first one, yeah. So I'm going to briefly talk about my journey and why I came to this broader realization. I run a podcast called The Seen and the Unseen. It started 8 years ago. Now, when it started, I had the mistaken impression that people have short attention spans, that you got to hook them in the first 15 seconds. Ki 15 minutes se upar hona nahi chahiye. People don't have time. That was my impression. And I realized very soon that I was completely wrong on all of these. And there are 3 reasons for this. That when people listen to podcasts, typically they are, number one, they're always a captive audience. People listen to podcasts on their smartphones when they're, either they're working out, they're going running or whatever, or they're commuting, or they're doing errands. right? And they're a captive audience. If you're watching a YouTube video at any moment, you can just, hit another tab, turn your head, talk to a friend. With a podcast, that's not happening. If you're out running, you won't keep changing channels. Second, people listen at higher speeds, which surprised me because I thought speed high hoga, so it'll be squeaky and etc., etc. But the brain can comprehend language at 500 words a minute. I speak at about 160 words a minute, as most of us do. And therefore, there is a lot of spare capacity. And anyone who listens to podcasts regularly knows the trick that first you take it to 1.2x, then that normalizes, then you take it to 1.5, and everybody finds a sweet spot. And you lose nothing. You lose no nuance. You don't lose any gaps. The brain adjusts for all of that. So reason 2. And reason number 3 is about this whole short attention span thing. People crave depth. The media out there does not give you depth. Everything out there in the mainstream media is a mile wide and an inch deep. And people really want to go deep. Like all of us have that shallow mode where we are swiping, scrolling. But by and large, we want to get into rabbit holes. Nobody else gives us that, right? And as I realized that, I also realized that it is my longer episodes which were really working. My first 1-hour episode was my most popular till then. Then over time, I started doing deep dives into subjects rather than, just look at one narrow issue. I'd have episodes which were 3-4 hours. Those became super popular. I moved to deep dives into people, almost like oral histories. My latest episode was 10.5 hours, right? And I've had a bunch of 8-hour episodes. And the thing is, these are wildly popular. And this took me completely by surprise because the original conventional thinking was that 1 hour is a deep dive, right? That was the original conventional thinking. You don't need to do more than that. Now, by going deeper, and there are many other long-form podcasts in the world which do really well, Lex Fridman and so on. So it's not unusual that people are listening to 5-6 hour podcasts, they're listening at double speed, they listen when they go out running or when they're commuting. I often say that, Bangalore's traffic is a boon to me. Please never solve that problem. But here's what I realized about form. I realized having, made that journey from shorter podcasts to longer one, and it's a show of conversations. I realized that the form makes a huge difference to what the content is, and it can also change the person who's doing the thing. If you're doing a 5-minute interview with someone, you do not even need to read their book. You can just ask them standard, banal, cookie-cutter questions and you get by. If you do half an hour or 1 hour interviews with people, maybe you need to read their book and their bio, but that's about it. If you're doing 5 hours, if you're doing 10 hours, that simply doesn't cut it. You have to know everything about them, read every book they have written, know the subject really well. So it takes that kind of immersion, which is beautiful. And also, the whole nature of the conversation, the rhythm is very different. Because you have to listen. As Stephen Covey once said, we listen to respond, we don't listen to understand. But when you're doing these long conversations, to maintain it, you have to take your ego out of the window and just listen and go wherever the conversation goes. This is one reason I'm the only man in India who knows how to listen. See, all the women are laughing, the men are like, kya bol raha hai? So this was an interesting realization about form, because what I was able to do would not have been possible 20 years ago. The audio you heard was on radio. Nobody would give you more than 40 minutes, 50 minutes, right? But here you have longer conversations which have a different kind of feel to them. A 5-hour conversation is not equivalent to 5 1-hour conversations. Because once you settle into the zone where you know you're going to be sitting for a few hours and you're really going to open up, you enter a completely different kind of phase, as it were. So what the form is, in this narrow instance, I realize changes what the content is, and then that changes the person, because you are adapting to that, becoming a better listener being one of the ways, right? And as I looked around me at what people call the creator ecosystem, I realized that in every aspect of the creative arts, we have been imprisoned by form. So I'm going to talk about music for a bit. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right, so what you see is a bunch of birds, right? And it was a realization to me that even birds, it's not like, different birds have different sounds. We don't think about why. Their bird song is influenced by their environment, right? So if you are in dense foliage, for example, the typical bird sound you'll hear is a constant repetitive signal in a narrow frequency. So if something gets lost, it's okay, you're repeating the same damn thing again, right? If you're on the forest floor, you'll have lower pitched calls because they are more likely to get through. If you're on water, water birds will have calls that deal with the acoustic challenges of water. If you are, throwing your call over a long distance, you'll have sort of buzzing calls which go further, right? And it's fascinating that all of them have evolved to the circumstances, and yet we actually ignore the circumstances once they are there. We don't think about it. We don't think about why a particular sound is a particular way. Next slide, please. So this is a great sort of visual graph of how animals sound across frequencies. This was done by Bernie Krause. And this tells you that, different animals and birds and so on are at different points of the audio frequency. And this is fascinating because what he did was he ran it for a few years, I think in Borneo, where there was a drought. And there's a video of this, which, I haven't got here because I'll share the link with you anytime you want. But that video shows a graph like this where gradually sounds start disappearing from the oral ecosystem, which means that, birds and animals are gradually disappearing till it's almost silent. So even if you're not doing a census of the species in the birds, you can actually tell from the sonic landscape exactly what's going on there. And the reason I bring this out is that all animals do this, all creatures do this. The sounds we make, the music we hear, it evolves out of circumstances. Next slide, please. So what was the earliest music? The earliest music is out in the open air, right? And therefore, the earliest music, no surprise there, is mainly percussive, because that travels easily through large spaces, right? That doesn't get distorted in any way because there are no walls to distort it. And therefore, a lot of that early music that has evolved in various places is percussive. Sadly, I must say, I live in Bombay and Warsaw, so when the Ganpati procession happens, that also is percussive, right? But it's percussive because it's outdoors. You won't hear thumris and khayals over there, right? It is the way it is for a particular reason. Next slide, please. If you look at Western music in the medieval ages, right, it's largely played in these large Gothic cathedrals, which are completely open. Now, if you play the earlier percussive music there, it would be sonic mush. It would make no sense. It would be nonsense, right? So the kind of music that evolves is really different. There's a great book on this by David Byrne, former frontman of the Talking Heads, called How Music Works, which I'll recommend. But I'll read out a line from there, which, where he describes what's going on here, where he says, the reverberation time in these spaces is very long, more than 4 seconds in most cases. So a note sung a few seconds ago hangs in the air and becomes part of the present sonic landscape. A composition with shifting musical keys would inevitably invite dissonance as notes overlapped and clashed, real sonic pileup. So what evolved, what sounds best in this kind of space, is modal in structure, often using very long notes, slowly evolving melodies that SU key changes work beautifully and reinforce the otherworldly ambience. And this is also why, a lot of Indian classical people will say, ki, "Arey, Western music, it's so harmonically simple." But it's harmonically simple for a reason. If it was harmonically complex, with the kind of reverberation that is out there, it would simply not sound the same. It wouldn't make sense, and which is why you also, don't have much percussion kind of going on there. And if you look at the evolution of Western classical, for example, you have Bach with his pipe organ, you have Mozart, who's actually making music for large rooms in palaces, depending on who his patrons were, and not these large halls. And then by the time you have these vast open spaces, we have someone like Gustav Mahler. And they are all optimizing, without realizing it, for the space. Their music, their art has been shaped by the space itself. It is not that this music is superior or that music is superior or there is something inherent in one's culture, we like this kind of stuff. It is in the space and then you ascribe qualities to it. But the point is it was entirely circumstantial. Next slide, please. Now, if you think of the evolution of jazz, it's really interesting because the evolution of jazz, there are two aspects to it. One is it's happening in kind of closed spaces. So you don't have that reverberation problem. In fact, you have a lot of furniture. You have chairs, you have people sitting, sometimes people dancing. So, that separation of sound is there. So therefore, you can have more complexity, more instruments, you can have the percussion back, that comes into play. Equally, what's happening is in the days before amplifiers, if you look at the jazz instruments, some of the classic instruments like the trumpet, for example, or before amplification, the banjo was preferred to the guitar because they're louder, right? That's the reason they're part of jazz. There's no other intrinsic reason they're louder. Another sort of interesting aspect is that jazz in many ways catered to people who were dancing. So we think of jazz as similar to Indian classical, ki there's a lot of improvisation and all that. But the real reason is these jazz singers would be playing and the notation would run out and they'd have to keep the solo going or they'll have to keep the music going because people are dancing. So out of that circumstance, you have something of great beauty emerging. And that's kind of the origin of it. Next slide, please. This is from the mid-70s. If any of you are fans of alternative rock, as I am, you'll know that this is a place called CBGB's. It was a classic club in New York where a lot of the great underground bands were born. And this kind of shows you what's going on here. It's incredibly crowded. Everyone's close together. And, that kind of classical music would simply not fit here. But the kind of rock and alternative and, shoegaze, as it were, is perfect for this. Punk rock originated at this particular club that you see here. And it's perfect. You can, make out all the nuances of the different music. Next slide, please. And these are stadiums. Now, if you think about what is suited to stadiums, right? Funk will never be in a stadium. There's too much nuance. You need to kind of listen to everything. So you'll never have funk in a stadium. But a stadium is sort of perfect for these broad, repetitive, sonic sort of textures. And therefore, metal is perfect. This is, in fact, from a Metallica concert. Any Metallica fans here in the front rows? All right. Thank you. And obviously, it's evolved from there. Now you listen to music in headphones. That can require a different kind of, adjustment and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay, who can identify this guy? Anyone? Make a guess. Bolo? No, it's a little before Elvis Presley. That is Bing Crosby. And I can see Prahlad in the background. He's singing, Bing ne to mere liye jingle gaya tha. The zing thing by the Bing thing. But so this is a really significant image because he's singing into a mic. And that mic was a new innovation at the time. And it changed the whole ball game. How did it change the whole ball game? You guys might have heard the term crooning, right? Where you're gently singing softly, you're not throwing your voice into a mic, and it can sound so sensuous and nice and so on, right? And that wasn't possible a generation ago. That wasn't possible before the microphone. So if you look at the way people are performing in open arenas without that kind of amplification, what do you have to do? You have to throw your voice. And when you have to throw your voice, that imperative creates a certain kind of vocal music. And we still have opera as a survivor, a survivor of that. And he starts singing with the mic and the whole ball game, changes. And different changes within the tools people use, how they record. Like early on, what would happen is when a band would record in the early days, there'd be one mic in the middle, right? And everybody else would gather around and there'd be people called, I think, pushers. Right? So somebody would sing and do his part, or guitar part aa gaya to usko aage kar diya because they want that to be louder. It was kind of like that. And that involves a certain kind of music. And when you evolve to a stage where people are sort of recording differently, it goes to a different place. It also matters, how these are stored. Next slide, please. Right. So where does a 3-minute pop song comes from? The 3-minute pop song, even though it's really easy to digest and remember, it doesn't come because of that. The evolution of the 3-minute pop song is because of a physical restraint. At the start of the 20th century, music was stored on these 78 RPMs, right? And the 10-inch version of that, I think the 10-inch version of that could hold 3 minutes. So it was that physical constraint which brought about, that notion that this is conventional, this is standard, and you have the 3-minute pop song from there. There's no other reason that 3 minutes is better than 5 minutes or 1 minute. That is a convention that comes. And then it works for radio because, if you've got 1-hour shows happening, the 3-minute nuggets fit in neatly. And what happens here is that a form shapes a certain kind of music. And then that kind of music shapes us because then we rewire our brains to think in these 3-minute nuggets, to think of them as radio friendly. All of those structures evolve, right? And in 1948, Columbia brings out the RPM, the long playing record. And that can hold, guess how much? About 40 minutes, right? 20 minutes on each side. And so the convention of the album comes from there. You can pack more music in, but you pack in any more than 20 minutes on each side, you instantly have sort of distortions and things going wrong. So that becomes a convention. Now, we often think of albums as this hallowed art form, and we say कि अरे आजकल लोग गाने सुनते हैं, हमारे time में concept album हुआ करते थे, etc., etc. But where did it come from? Why 40 minutes? You know, why not more than that? The big bands could have double albums. Or why not less than that? Because that is how much would fit. And that was a physical constraint. After that came the compact disc, right? And the compact disc holds 74 minutes of music, right? And just hit the button once, isi pe ek aa jayega. Yeah. So this is a gentleman named Norio Oga. He was heading Sony at the time the compact disc was created, and I think they were collaborating with Philips. And Philips said, let's make it 60 minutes. And Norio Oga thought about it a lot, and there was space to make it more, and he decided 74 minutes. Can anyone guess why? Or does anyone know why? No. The next, just hit it once again. Yeah, that's it. Because he was a fan of Beethoven, and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, in its longest version, was 74 minutes. So for that idiosyncratic, reason, this comes about. Now what happens from there is that music goes digital. It goes digital, but bands will still release in album format because that is how they think of it. You know, it's not like कि 6 अच्छे गाने हैं 6 निकाल देते हैं. But no, you're kind of structured to think in terms of albums. As an old school music listener, you're structured to think in terms of expecting albums, expecting 3-minute song. None of it makes sense. And there is, in fact, the imperatives within the music business have changed completely. For example, Spotify has a rule that a band only gets paid if 30 seconds of a song are played. So if 30 seconds are played of a particular song, the band gets paid, and they don't get anything extra. So 30 seconds is a target to aim for. Next slide, please. So keeping this in mind, a band called Wolfpack came up with an album called Sleepify, which was all silence, 30 seconds of silence, as you can see. And they told their sort of followers that when you're sleeping, just put this on, we'll get money for it. Right? And I love the song titles, by the way. Aapko kaun sa zzz pasand aaya? But yeah, and Spotify obviously cottoned onto it and they took it off. Next slide. And this is a band called the Pocket Gods. They released 100 Beatles songs, but 30-second covers. Right? I particularly like I Wanna Hold Your Hand While You Sign My Check for £1 million. So, and these are serious, because many ways in which bands earlier used to make money no longer work. Spotify is the thing, album sales are gone. It's all streaming. So what do? You got to adapt to what is there. So your incentive is ki, you know, if you want to write a 28-second masterpiece, nahi yaar, 2 minute, 2 second dal do. And so on and so forth. So that's kind of where this evolved from. And TikTok also plays a part in this. Like now what has become standard within the music business is that, the 15-second TikTok hook. Now songwriters are not told that you necessarily have to do this particular structure. A guy called Max Martin, who's written songs for, Beyonce, Britney, all those guys, he's got a particular formula to it, a set of chords, a particular structure. Even that doesn't really matter anymore. Your labels are telling you कि 15-second का TikTok hook दे दो हमें, and how the TikTok algorithm works, and you see the accidents of history and how they can shape a genre. The way the TikTok algorithm works is that every time you like a video, you are automatically assumed to be liking the audio also. So you will be served more videos with the same audio. And this is how things go viral, right? And at this point, you might think, oh my God, Amit, things have gotten worse. What are you saying? Things have gotten better. Abhi to 30 seconds hai, ye hai. But, next slide, please. As I will point out by the end of this, actually, we have been set free by all of the technology. We are not slaves to the imperatives anymore. And speaking of free, there are many army people here. So I will tell a General Kariyappa story, right? And I'm sure all the army people have heard this, but for the other 3 people, this will be new. That when India gained independence in 1947, General Kariyappa wanted to give a speech to his soldiers, the particular soldiers who were where he was, where he wanted to tell them, today you are free, I am free, the nation is free. And his translation wasn't very good, so he just translated free and he told them, "Is waqt aap muft, hum muft, mulk muft hai." So I'm gonna, right now you clap. Itna gyan de raha hu, now you clap with a cheap joke. All right, next slide, please. So now I'm, going to talk about writing, right? A lot of the evolution we know, it's kind of obvious, it's kind of banal, that early on you just have oral history, there's no form of putting anything down, that is cumbersome, how much can you remember, Chinese whispers come into play. Then you have scrolls, made of papyrus, but even that is a problem because how much can you unwind something? And eventually the printing press comes and, that's really the big deal that becomes the first game changer. And by the way, when the printing press first came, a lot of the objections to it, if I take them, I should have actually done that. Some of the quotes, some of the objections people have are identical to the objections people have about the internet today. Every new technology in its time has met with such resistance. Even scrolls and papyrus in the earlier days, people said that, no, you can't write it down, it's apna tradition chal raha hai, etc., etc. Next image, please. Right, so this is one of the early books. It's a book called Del Edelstein. It's written by a guy called Ulrich Bonner, which is a great name, Ulrich Bonner. I believe his wife used to complain to people that every morning I get up and Bonner has a boner. But leaving, see, it's a Khushwant Singh festival. I have to make some jokes that would make him happy, right? And what happens with the printing press is somebody laughed late. So what happened with the printing press was not just that you could print stuff, but you also had to look at technologies of distribution. What are you printing? How is it going around? In the early days, it's pamphlets, right? And this changes political speech. People, you look at Thomas Paine's Common Sense or Mary Wollstonecraft's pamphlet at exactly the same time before she wrote Vindication for the Rights of Women. You have pamphlets going around the continent because they're easy to go around. And eventually, eventually books come into play. And books, because of the grammage of paper, because of how much thickness you can bind, eventually end up, having a floor and a ceiling. And if you think about it, that floor and the ceiling, how short can a book be, how long can a book be, has everything to do with those physical constraints. There is nothing ki 200 page ka book hona chahiye necessarily. Like one of the great tragedies is that there was this book called The Power Broker by Robert Caro. Some of you may have read it. Masterpiece, came out in 75. And when the publisher got it, Robert Gottlieb, it was 1 million words. And he said, I can't do this. And he spoke to his printing press people, and they realized the max they could do was 800,000 words. So he cut out a 200,000 word chunk on Jane Jacobs, and one of my absolute heroes. And that's a tragedy. And today that would not have to happen. You could just dump the whole thing online, let people access it in any case. 19th century newspapers start coming up. And these start changing the way people consume information, the way people learn about the world. I had once done an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with Swapna Little, great historian who wrote this magnificent book called The Broken Script, which is a history of Delhi in the first 50 years of the 19th century. And what you have there is a scene where, number one, poetry is drawing the crowd. So it becomes a custom that every day the newspaper will have a poem in it. And not just Zafar's poem because emperor and all that was happening, but other poetry. And you would then have mushairas, which people would go to. And these entrepreneurs started going to the mushairas, writing down every poem, and then publishing it as a newsletter, right? Circa 1820s, 1830s. And this is magnificent, because the moment this starts happening, the kind of writing you do could change. And the fact that you can actually, and these newsletters would also have essays on the form by other people, right? And you read something like that, you are no longer getting a piecemeal education on poetry by listening to random poems here and there. You're actually getting an education from first principles. So the form is changing the way we interact with the content, it is changing the content, and we are learning from it. But we are still, in a manner of speaking, slaves to it. And for me, the internet and blogging made a big difference. I ran a fairly popular blog, India Uncut, from circa 2003 onwards. And next slide, please. Yeah, and that's not me. Yeah, so I should pretend it's a younger me. It's a good-looking guy. So, and blogging freed me up in many ways. Now, I was in mainstream media at the time. I was a managing editor at one publication. I've written columns for every Indian paper at the time. Blogging was so freeing for me because I could write about whatever the hell I wanted. I wasn't slave to the news cycle. I didn't have a gatekeeper. I didn't have a house style that, some editor is saying, no, this is our style, you can't, use these words. Form did not constrain me. Earlier, your standard piece, it's 800 words. I could write 80 words. I could write 8 words. This is before microblogging, before Twitter and other social media replaced all of blogging's functions. So sometimes I'd just put a line with a link. I did some 8,000 posts in 5 years, at 5 posts a day. Great writing practice, but also the freedom of the form. You write 80 words, you write 8,000 words. There is no gatekeeper. You can write about whatever the hell you want. And and the means of production are with me. Right? Incredibly freeing and, so meaningful to me. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to do all of the visual arts in one slide because picture paints 1,000 words. So, though I'll try not to speak that much. Again, a lot of this evolution, in a sense, is kind of banal. Ki, theek hai, you had cave paintings. Obviously, you're not going to have, perspective in 3D and all of that. That's fine. You evolve to the Middle Ages. You have art evolving, you have photography coming in. I'm kind of going to talk about the audiovisual medium a little bit. That we are, again, so stuck to these forms. That a Western film is 90 minutes, right? A Bollywood film is 3 hours because, yeah, we got more time and all of that, poor country. Escapism required. And once television happens, your average serial is 24 minutes, right? A half-an-hour show would be 24 minutes plus those 2 commercial breaks. So that's the action that you have. And actually, those constraints simply don't exist anymore. Like I spoke of the lie of the short attention span earlier. Another illustration of that, forget my podcast, another illustration of that is how many of you binge watch? People say short attention span, I will start watching something or fir 8 ghanta dekhenge and miss office the next day. If any of you have office, I don't. So, and equally, you can do your 30-second reels, you can do your 1-minute YouTube shorts, you can go on YouTube and you can do any length you want. Those constraints have kind of vanished. And there's an interesting way I like to think about how the form shapes the content and it shapes you, right? What happens when you're watching a film on the big screen? There's a certain distance between you and the screen, and there's actually a similar distance between the camera and the characters. So you have your great westerns, you have your car chases, there is a distance there. You come in a little closer, you have television. Television is a couple of meters away from you, and you have your great indoor dramas where the camera is a couple of meters away from whoever's there. So you have Friends and Seinfeld and all of that. You take one step further and you come to the YouTube video, which you're watching from your phone or a laptop in front of you. And the camera is again much closer, it is in your face. And I think of a similar thing about audio. Like people will often think, audio podcasts are audio on demand. Yeah, it's like Netflix is for films. It's like that. Actually, it's not. Like, if I am to take that metaphor further, I would say a radio with its imperatives to get large audiences because of the license fees they've paid, etc., is much broader. It is like 5 people are in a car, radio is playing. You got to cater to all of them. You can't, get too niche, right? Whereas podcasting is a voice in your head. It is completely personal. Like, one of the best compliments I got was I'd done an episode with Abhinandan Sekhri, and someone wrote in to say that I felt so much that I was sitting with 2 friends in my living room that at one point I interrupted you. Right? That is the incredible intimacy of the form. And because the technology, because the imperatives change, you can do so much more with it. Where else can you get that intimacy? You can get it on the big screen, but nah, not really, not most of the time. Yeah, Bergman and all, TK, but not most of the time. It's not suited for that. Each form brings about a particular kind of content. And technology's become really cheap. Like I have a YouTube show also called Everything is Everything. And the 2 cameras we shoot it with 3 cameras. 2 of them I have at home. They are far more advanced than anything all the great filmmakers of the time, Satyajit Ray, Kurosawa, Bergman had with them. And they cost just a fraction, they cost nothing. Like the means of production have gone down so sharply, so starkly, it's mind-blowing. As a podcaster, I have a home studio, I built it from scratch on what is just budget, and I could not have dreamed of it 30 years ago. But it is, so incredibly easy to do. Next slide. Yeah, and so here is my final kind of big lesson. Why, the world has changed for artists, is that art no longer needs to scale. And you will note cunningly that there is a scale at the bottom of this guitarist. But yeah, art no longer needs to scale. What used to happen back in the time is that you can have a mediocre engineer, mediocre doctor, mediocre lawyer, paisa banayega, right? But if you have a mediocre writer or a mediocre, filmmaker, they're not doing anything. Mediocre filmmaker to bana bhi nahi payega. You either have to be in the top 1% where you really make the money, or you fit that stereotype of the starving writer in the attic. Now that has changed. That has changed because number one, you have the means of production in your hand. There are no gatekeepers. You can make what you want. Number two, you're reaching people directly. You don't have to go via somebody. So scaling is not important. You can find a niche and make it profitable. In 2009, Kevin Kelly wrote this great essay called 1,000 True Fans. And Kelly's funda was this, that as an artist, you don't need to be a Beyonce, right? You find 1,000 true fans who are willing to pay $100 a year, and you're getting $100,000 a year, and that's enough. And 3 years ago, there was a follow-up to that essay by some Chinese lady, I've forgotten her name, called 100 True Fans, where what she said was that if you get 100 people to pay you $1,000 a year, you are set. Again, you're making 100K. Now, Kelly wrote his essay in 2009. It is true on Substack today. Your average Substack subscription is $100 a year. And there are plenty of people who otherwise you wouldn't have heard of through mainstream media who make money that way. A couple of years back, Barry Weiss left the New York Times and started her Substack. Just today, I read that it's valued at 100 million, right? Just started on her own just like that. And for what it's worth, I have both 100 true fans and 1,000 true fans. But I will never scale and be a Shah Rukh Khan or whatever, right? So it changes the way that you think about it. And part of it is that you can build a community in a way you couldn't earlier. Right? In the 1990s, if I want to write, what will happen, right? And I think Bachi will sympathize with me over here, is that I would send a piece to the Times of India, some gatekeeper would see it, they would publish it. And you might read the piece, and you might think, arey, this Amit Varma, interesting guy. But then you forget about me. And then 2 months later, a piece comes in Indian Express, say, sorry, I went to them also. Piece comes in the Indian Express also. You say, name sounds familiar, it's nice, but that's it, right? Today, two things have changed. One is that you can build a community of your fans. If you read a piece by me, typically like, which is why I teach a writing course, I advise all my students, start newsletters. Because what happens therefore is that if I read a piece by you, I hit that subscribe button and everything else you write in the future comes to my inbox, right? And whether you're with Substack or Ghost or whatever, your email database belongs to you. So you're building a community of people who care about your work. Tomorrow you launch a YouTube show. Tomorrow you crowdfund a project you're doing. They are all yours. You're accumulating them over time. And the other important thing, which I don't think people have really grasped yet, is that the traditional model is dead. Like in the 90s, what would happen is that Times of India would pay a lot of people for a bunch of pieces. They would aggregate eyeballs. They would sell it to advertisers. And the creator would get a tiny, tiny sliver of that money, right? What is beginning to happen is that creators are directly reaching consumers. That friction of how do we pay is gone. Like if someone reads a piece by you, they're not reading it for free. They're paying for it because time is money. And earlier, there was no technology that could transfer some of that value to you. Today, there is. The mainstream is dying. I think in 20 years, the current advertising model in 10 years will be completely broken. And nothing has really taken the place of the institutions that are there. So I think this is just such a phenomenally exciting time for creators everywhere that I actually feel a little sad. I think if Khushwant Singh ji was alive today, and I used to read him in the 80s and 90s, and such a great columnist, such a conversational style, writing so many columns time after time. Someone we all remember more than other writers of that age because he really spoke to us. It was a personal connect, right? He would have thrived in this era because he would not have said ki arey main column likhunga ya main book likhunga, the two things he did really well. I think he would have made Instagram reels. I think he would have made TikTok. If they hadn't banned it in India, he would have been a TikTok superstar, right? So he was, in a sense, a quintessential 2025 person. And with that, I'll end with my final slide. No, so yeah, you go on to the next one. Next slide. Yeah, so I think he would have approved. So thank you. Q&A, anyone? There's a hand there, lady in the middle. I think someone will give you a mic.
Hello. So thank you for that. That's an amazing talk. And of course, technology has helped us. My only question is, like, people like you, Khushwant Singh sir and everyone, you've had conversations, you've spoken, you've changed ideas, we've gained knowledge. The generation that's coming up next, they're using chat GPT. They're influenced by maybe things they see. They don't see both ends of a topic a lot of times. But the creativity seems to be dying in terms of like how I would probably innovate a Goldilocks into multiple stories ahead. Do you feel technology is sort of killing that aspect?
Yes and no. See, here's the thing. In every generation, 95% of people are sheep. They're not reading. People say कि reading habit नहीं है. अरे हमारे time में भी reading habit नहीं था. Small bunch of people read books. Small bunch of people, small percentage of that percentage I don't think has changed. And people in the books business will tell you the same thing. So I think people who want to go deep will go deep. It is a problem when you use technology as a crutch. I am super optimistic about technology. Like all these images you saw today are technology only, right? I made them last night. So I see most of them. So I see technology as a fantastic tool. Now the problem is a lot of people will use it as a crutch. I think that's terribly dangerous. Because if you're just going to give a topic to ChatGPT and tell it what to say and it writes for you, you are not actually physically writing. And people who write regularly know that writing makes you a better thinker. It is not just a one-way connection that being a clear thinker makes you more likely to be a clear writer. But if you force yourself to write clearly, in language that everyone can understand, it forces yourself to think clearly, to know your subject better. You can't hide behind abstract jargon or vague words. You have to get to the heart of the matter. So I think that will be lost, but it will be lost for people who wouldn't have cultivated it anyway. So I'm not too worried about that. So yeah, that's... Bachi over there. I didn't really write for Indian Express. Huh? I mean, I did, but...
No, that's fine. I don't have any particular brief for the Times of India, other than that they publish me now. My question is just related to that, and that is that you say, while you were speaking of Substack, I said, oh wow, why don't I just make a Substack of my column, and I've got all my friends who will read it, and I can make my money there. But there's technology, and then there's marketing, and the Times of India is what provides the marketing. So an individual setting out, how do they deal with the marketing?
So I am, of course, speaking from a position where I got really lucky. But where I stand now, I don't need any marketing. But my philosophy always has been, and this is perhaps too idealistic, but my philosophy always has been that I will focus 100% of my effort on product or on the work I do and 0% on marketing. And that takes care of itself organically. This is what I've found over time. Now, what happens is a lot of creators, and this is important advice for all the young people at the back, perhaps if they ever want to be creators, is that creators tend to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. So, they'll start a newsletter or they'll start a vlog and they'll think, oh, it's going to go viral, I'm going to get big. And if it doesn't happen in 6 months, they get disheartened and then they give up. It never works like that. It takes a lot of time, and the reason for that is whenever you start something, number one, no one knows you then. Number two, you suck. You always suck at the start, right? You only get better by doing something again and again. If you're going to depend on validation to do something again and again, then you'll never get better and you'll never get validation, so it's a vicious cycle. But if you just do something you love and you do it for that reason and you have faith in the process, then eventually it'll work out. One, you'll get really good at it, which of course, Bachi, you don't need to get good at anything. But what would happen if you were to do that is that you would be surprised at the following that builds up and what it gets you. Like another sort of narrow insight I'll get, which people don't often understand, even I got to figure it out recently, is that I now say that I'd rather have 100,000 people download my audio podcast and 20 million people watch a YouTube thing I do. And the reason for that is that the 20 million YouTube views will have an average of 15 seconds or 20 seconds, whereas my podcast has an average session time of 40 minutes, right? And it's not a humble brag, long-form podcasts these days do. But if you told me that in the 2000s when I was an internet professional, I would have said you're freaking lying. It's maybe for the most immersive video game, but otherwise it's not possible. So therefore, what happens is that the mainstream might give you a lot of viewers with shallow engagement. They don't really care about you. It's not personal. They're not going to interrupt you. But you can have smaller numbers and a far deeper engagement, right? So someone like you, for example, you'd come on board with an existing army of fans, and then newer people would discover you, because no one reads Times of India, the physical newspaper these days. It's become an artifact कि घर पे आता है, 3 अखबार आते हैं, 4 अखबार आते हैं. But I think the reading habit of physical newspapers has completely gone down. So I would, if we can talk offline, I would encourage everybody, in fact, not just someone like her, that start a newsletter. I've taught my writing course to some 2,700 people. Many of them have done this, and it's worked miracles for them. Because one, it helps you do writing that is not self-conscious. You're writing all the time, you're writing regularly, that automatically makes you better. You discover things about yourself, you can experiment with form, and over time you gain an organic following that is all yours. Never again will someone read a piece by me and then lose track of me. Because if they like it, they'll hit the button and, they're part of my tribe for the rest of my life.
I have the mic.
Yes, ma'am. Another legend, that's the great Satya Saran.
Blush. Achha, listen, I want to ask, in this day of technology jumping ahead of itself and changing every 3 minutes, how long does something that is technologically embedded last? I mean, how long will your podcasts remain before they go into oblivion?
I think at this moment in time, whatever is there will kind of remain. Unless a species is wiped out and all technology goes and an asteroid hits, we can't control that. And the law of truly large numbers say that it's inevitable to happen, no matter how unlikely. But I think it'll kind of remain, and what also happens is after a while, what you do doesn't really belong to you anymore. Your fans will make sure that it remains, and your fans will make sure it stays, and there's a lot of stuff that kind of happens around that. So I think it'll remain, and I think it'll, see, here's the thing, Sturgeon's law says 95% of everything is scrap. That is as true today as it ever was, right? So obviously, through time, a lot of that 95% disappears, and some of it may be good stuff that no one recognizes. Like, people don't realize we speak of Bach. Bach in his lifetime was not the superstar he is today. It was 70, 80 years after his death that there was a little bit of a revival. You look at the story of how Billy Joel's Piano Man almost sank into oblivion till somebody persistently ran after DJs and paid one guy to play it, and then it kind of took off. So a lot of great work gets lost. I actually think that this is kind of poignant and, and I won't say it's a problem, it's an interesting situation for these days, because my way of thinking about it is that if you just look at the number of people, both in absolute terms and in percentage terms, who can create their own art, right? I think it dwarfs everything that came before the 20th century put together by a long way. So technically, there are Da Vinci's and Michelangelo's and Shakespeare's out there who aren't mainstream, so we might not recognize them as such. But in their small groups, in their niches, in their audience, like in Bombay, there's a cult around the Peter Cat Recording Company, if you've ever heard of them. Fantastic band, right? Yeah. So, so you might be in those niches, but I think any artist who hankers for legacy, and I want to be known as great, is hankering for the wrong thing. You do things for the love of it, and you want to find an audience in your lifetime that gives you that love and sustains you, and that is so possible today, and it never was. So, yeah.
How long do you think the creative arts will survive? Writing, storytelling, animation, music, with artificial intelligence snapping at their heels?
So I'd answer it two ways. One is that even though I'm not a huge fan of the content ChatGPT churns out now, because its LLM is everything, so 95% of everything is scrapped, so the prose is terrible. However, I'm an optimist that in the future, I think that it'll be able to do anything, and it'll blow our minds, right? I did an 8-hour episode with Jerry Pinto, and I was talking about his great book, Murder in Mahim. And he kind of agreed with me when I said that 10 years later, I'll be able to feed all his work and everything about Mahim to a GPT and say, write me 10 novels in this series, and it will happen. The question is this a threat to us? And I think it's not, because there are these terms, thin desire and thick desire, first originated by the French philosopher René Girard. And a thin desire is something that you want because other people want it. It's a mimetic desire. So if you're a young macho boy in Gurgaon, you'll want Mercedes and you'll want all of those things. If you're a young person anywhere, you'll say, I want to get married and have kids. But do you really, really want it? Or do you just want that because that's a done thing and everybody wants that? So those are thin desires which can be very intense. When Nike Air Jordan came out, people killed for it in the US. Thin desire, but can be intense. A thick desire is, what do you intrinsically want to do? And the way I think of writing is, there's a thin desire component and a thick desire component. The thin desire component is you want to write because you want to be seen as a writer, you want to win this prize, that prize, get called to the Kasoli Lit Fest, right? So those are thin desires. Those will vanish. right? Because AI might be able to create much better art than you can. What is a thick desire? The thick desire is that when I sit down with a pen and paper or keyboard and laptop, I am creating magic. I'm using words to create something that wasn't there before. It's the love of writing, the love of storytelling. That thick desire won't go. And as long as you have that, just have faith that that will matter. And of course, most people aren't as terribly optimistic ki AI likhega Murder in Mahim ka or this novel. But either ways, I think if you're motivated by the love of what you do, trust me, you'll be fine.
Amit, I just wanted one question on podcasting because you're such a successful podcaster, and that seems to me as quite a future kind of a chat show format. I want to know what have been the challenges. I mean, I can see 70 episodes, 80 episodes, but you must have gone through a very tough cycle to get where you were. So tell us just a quick thing about what works in podcasting and what doesn't work.
I've done more than 400 episodes over 8 years, so it was a weekly show. I think the challenge for me was a cognitive thing. Like today I sat here and I gave you all this gyan in one package, right? I didn't have this when I started. I had to learn it by doing. कि नहीं यार 20 मिनट से ज़्यादा हो सकता है. कि नहीं यार 1 घंटा हो सकता है. Then if you do 3 hours, how do you structure it? How do you think about it? No one in the world has done 8-hour, 10-hour episodes like I have. It's a new field. There's no, long-form podcasting for dummies. So I had to figure it out myself कि ये कैसे करते हैं. How do you structure a conversation? How do you make someone comfortable? What are the areas you go? What is the balance? Like when I do one of these sort of long 8-hour, 10-hour conversations, I think about building it around 3 scaffoldings, where one is a person's life, the other is their work, and the third is the ideas that come up in the course of the conversation which we discuss. So all this stuff I've learned on the way. So it seems smooth at the end of it. I give a talk, I give gyan, I make a bad joke, and that's the only time people laugh. But, so it's just a learning process. And I would say to all creators, have a bias for action and, just jump into it. This is a golden age. Don't let yourself be held back by anything.